Hey, hopefully you had a good break. So I'd like to welcome next Sander. Sander's going to give us an overview of cryptography. I'm really looking forward to this talk because my idea of cryptography was the Enigma machine in Bletchley Heath. So I'm sure things have changed since then. Please welcome Sander.
Thank you. By show of hands, how many of you have seen the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey? All right, that's quite a few. You probably know that one of the main characters in the movie is the computer that actually controls the spaceship, which is HAL. And when the movie came out, people noticed that HAL is actually derived from IBM. Because if you shift the letters from IBM to the left by one, you get HAL. Well, the writer of 2001: A Space Odyssey said that that was not intentional. We don't know if that's true, but there you go. It is, however, a nice example of a very simple encryption method, which is called the shift cipher, but it's also known as the Caesar cipher. And it bears this name because Caesar, Emperor Caesar, actually used this encryption method back in the day. It is a character substitution method. The idea is to shift all the letters in the alphabet by a fixed number of places, 1, 2, 3, anywhere up to 26, and then basically you've gone around. So B goes to A, C goes to B, etc. Decryption means doing the opposite. So A goes back to B, etc. Now you might wonder how this would be secure. You have to remember that back in the day, not a lot of people actually knew how to read or write Latin, but all communication would be in Latin. So by adding a simple method of encryption, Caesar was able to create very secure communications. And in the case of Caesar, he actually used a shift of -3. The most well-known form of shifting is probably RT13. And it has the added benefit of being symmetric. So encrypting is basically exactly the same thing as decrypting. So for instance, if you encrypt D, it goes to Q. But if you encrypt Q, it goes back to D. So it's, in that sense, it's symmetric. Character substitution also forms the basis of the device that I will talk about in the rest of my talk, which was just briefly mentioned, the Enigma, the German Enigma. The Enigma performs a proper character substitution in the sense that it doesn't just do a shift. You type a letter and a certain lamp would light up. So for instance, you would type a T, and it would show up as a K. It's also symmetric in the sense that when you use the same key, the same settings for the machine, if you then type the encrypted message, you will get the plain text back. So it's very, very handy in that sense. Now, I'd like to point out that from an electrical point of view, the Enigma machine is incredibly simple. It basically consists of a battery, of a switch, and a lamp. Close the switch, and the lamp will turn on. This is, of course, a gross simplification because the actual Enigma used 26 switches and 26 lamps and a bit of additional, I wouldn't call it electronics, but wiring to do the encryption. It is actually so simple that I was able to build a tiny little encryption device like this, which uses exactly the same core principle. It is extremely limited because it only has 4 characters, and it actually only uses 3 keys. But the principle is exactly the same. It shows that the character never encodes to itself, just like the Enigma. The only thing that this one doesn't do is go through all the keys, which is something that the Enigma actually does automatically. Now, the smarts of the Enigma are in the way the electrical circuit is closed using those 26 keys and 26 lamps. And this is done by a set of rotors. And each rotor performs a certain character substitution. Now, each Enigma M3 had 5 rotors, of which 3 would always use at once. On top of that, it had 2 static wheels, an entry wheel over there, and a reflector wheel over there. And basically, the current would flow through the entry wheel, through the 3 rotors, back through the reflector wheel, and back again through the rotors and the entry wheel, and then a lamp would light up. And I'd also like to point out there's something else here, which is the plug board, but I will get back to that. Now, the power of the Enigma was that each time you press a key, one of the rotors would actually rotate one position. And at some point, that one would actually rotate another one as well. I'll get back to that soon. So I just briefly mentioned the plug board. This was only used for the military Enigmas. There were also Enigmas used for postal services way before the war. But this was an addition that actually made it much more difficult to crack. And the plug board performed 2 additional substitutions, one on the way in and one on the way out. So the rotors would step based on the key presses, and just like a plain odometer that you would find in a car, at some point a rotor on the right would basically make the rotor to its left also step forward 1 step, and again for the rotor next to that. And what happens is that the actual character substitution of the machine changes every time you press a key. And this means that when you press 2 keys, two times the same key, you will not get the same result. So you press T1, so you might get K. You press T again, and you might get P, for instance. And what makes this very strong is that because you cannot sort of correlate the input with the output, it makes frequency analysis very difficult. So for instance, the letter E is very common in the English language, and if you could find a letter that's basically in the encrypted message just as often, you could infer that it might be the letter E. So that doesn't work in this case. Now each day, the Enigma would be set up by using predefined rotors, so 3 in the case of M3, in a predefined position, 1 of 26, and a predefined ringstellung. And the ringstellung basically meant how the next rotor would turn over. On top of that, there was, of course, the plug board setting. And the Germans always used 10 substitutions, always. But in other words, the key for the day was determined by those 4 settings. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about key space. And key space, according to Wikipedia, refers to the set of all possible permutations of a key. Now, remember the shift cipher? It only has a key space of 26. This one only has a key space of 3. It's worthless, really. So if the Allied forces would not have had any knowledge of the rotor's internals, then the key space would have been enormous, because just think about how many ways you could wire up a single rotor. In fact, it's about 1.5 times 10 to the power of 25. It's ridiculous. But the Allied forces actually knew how the rotors were wired. But the good thing for the Allied forces was that the Germans didn't know that the Allied forces knew this. So they overestimated the power of their Enigma. So I'd like to point out this guy. It's a Dutch guy. His name is Kerkhoff, and he came up with a principle that said a crypto system should be secure, even if everything about the system except the key is public knowledge. So this is why modern cryptographic methods are always publicly scrutinized. There is very little to no safety in security through obscurity. But the Germans may have overestimated the security of the Enigma by sort of ignoring this law. They should have assumed that the Allied forces had everything about the Enigma except the keys. Well, let's do a quick calculation about M3 key space. So we have to pick 3 out of 5 rotors. That gives us a total of 60 combinations. Each rotor has 26 positions, so that gives us 26 to the power of 3 equals 17,576. Then we have the ringstellung, which only applied to 2 of the rotors, which gives us another 676 combinations. But now it gets wild, because when we factor in the plug board, which always had 10 substitutions, we get a whopping 1.5 times 10 to the power of 14 permutations. So we have to multiply these together, and then we get the total key space of the M3, which is about 1.07 times 10 to the power 23, which equates to approximately 77 bits, which is pretty good for, for that time. And because the M4 used 3 rotors out of 8 plus a 4th one, it was actually 291 times stronger, so it had a key space of about 84 bits. Now let's do a quick recap. So far we've talked about encryption and decryption, character substitution and the shift cipher, frequency analysis, key space, security through obscurity, and Kerkhoff's law. Now let's talk a little bit about cracking the Enigma. How many of you, by show of hands, have seen the movie The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch? Wow, that's impressive. So this movie basically revolves around Alan Turing. And he played a pivotal role in cracking the Enigma. And most of the work, or maybe all of the work that was done to do this, was done at Bletchley Park in the UK. And Turing was one of the first people to be recruited there. I'll get back to him a little bit later. Because there is nothing easier than cracking an encryption system than having the keys. And the Allied forces were lucky enough to have the keys once or twice. They got the code book somehow from the Germans, so that gave them the opportunity to actually decrypt the messages that were sent. And the good thing was that it gave them information about what are the Germans actually sending, or what kind of messages are they sending, and can we maybe use that later on? And it turns out that they could. And when they got a hand of the keys, that was called a pinch. Now, I would like to point out a flaw in the design of Enigma, and this is called a double step. So each time the rightmost, at some point when the rightmost rotor turns over, it would also turn over the one to its left. And at some point, it would also turn over the one to its left. But due to a fault in the mechanical design, at some point, the middle rotor would actually turn over twice. And as a result, this would halve the key space. Well, this would still leave plenty enough room to not make it completely crackable just like that. So it wasn't that big a deal, but it did also help a little bit in statistical analysis. The electrical design, however, also contained a bit of a flaw, and that was, which I also mentioned about this device, is that a character never encodes onto itself. So a T would never encode into a T, and a Y would never encode into a Y, etc. So as the war raged on, the code breakers gained more and more knowledge of the messages that were actually sent. So for instance, they found patterns in the messages, in the original messages. So a lot of the messages would actually end with Heil Hitler. So these kinds of known texts, or assumed known texts, they were called crypts. And the Germans actually sent a weather report every day at 6 a.m. It had a very specific format. So let's take, for example, the crypt Wetterbericht, which means weather report in German. So if an encrypted text looked like this, then you can infer that certain places would not be the encrypted word crypt that was there, because in this case, the I matches, but the I can never encrypt itself. So this would be a wrong position to start checking. Now, Alan Turing, let's get back to him for a bit. He came up with a cryptoanalytic process called benverismus. And this was specifically created for German types of messages, German Navy types of messages, because of the process they used for encryption. So first of all messages for a single day used the same key, which were those 4 settings I told you about earlier. This was called the Grundstellung. But the actual message would be encrypted using a Kenngruppe, or sort of an indicator, which was sent twice at the beginning of each message. Now, all those Kenngruppen would be sent with the same key for a single day. Now, this process of benverismus considers whether encrypted messages are in depth, which is sort of a measure of correlation. Because all those Kenngruppen, or indicators, were encrypted with the same settings, they were all in depth. And this really helped with getting information about the settings for the Enigma for a certain day. At the end, I'll have a slide with some resources, and there's also a link to a site that has like really in-depth information about this process in case you are interested in it. Now, Alan Turing also understood that the only way to break Enigma every single day was to automate the process. So they built a machine called the bomb, which was basically named after a Polish device that was used to crack earlier Enigma machines. So the bomb basically used a method of elimination. It basically parallelized going through all the rotor settings. So what you're looking at is basically a parallel computer in a sense. And what it does is try and introduce the plugboard settings. That's the one that actually gave the Enigma its power. And it did this electrically, which made it really, really fast. And it would start by assuming a certain plugboard setting, like for instance, A goes to G. And then based on the message that it was fed, it would then try and deduce other settings like H goes to R or P goes to O until it found a contradiction. For instance, A goes to, I don't know, Z. You can't have A go to two characters. That's not how it works. We already know that. So when you found that contradiction, you knew it was wrong. But Alan Turing understood that all the other plugboard settings that you would find in that particular run, that they were also wrong, and you didn't have to check them. Now, there is another idiosyncrasy of the Enigma that makes cracking a little bit easier. So you know how all the rotors basically advance based on the rotor before. But the leftmost rotor hardly ever rotates, especially because messages were almost never longer than about 650 characters. So you could learn quite a lot by just focusing on the right two rotors. I'd like to think that the bomb may very well have been the first special purpose computer ever. And it was based on much of Turing's ideas about computing and algorithms and things like that. The entire effort of decrypting Enigma was an incredible feat of human ingenuity, and it was based in science, engineering, maths, and statistics. Now, there's a lot more to be said about Alan Turing. Think, for instance, about the Turing machine or the Turing test. There's also a lot more to be said about the Enigma itself. But the purpose of my talk was not to give you like a comprehensive overview of the Enigma and the efforts of cracking it, or about Turing. I did, however, address some concepts of cryptography that you might want to further study. So I do encourage you to find out more about Alan Turing, about the Turing machine, the Enigma, and about cryptography as a field of study. We've come a long way since the Enigma, even though for the time it was a really good machine. So have a look at the list of resources, which I'll put up next. And if you really want to know more about Alan Turing, I would say consider reading his biography, the biography about his life, because you will find out that much of his work did not occur in a vacuum, as hardly anything ever does. And if you want to play with Enigma, like a proper one, online at least, then just search for Enigma and you will find it. But there's one key takeaway I'd like to leave you with. Any encryption system can be broken, given enough time and effort. But when you have the key, you don't even need to go through that effort. So, to tie it in with our everyday lives, how are you treating your passwords? I hope that you keep them secure. So here are the resources. Take a picture if you would like to get more information. But for now, this is it. Thank you for listening.